The sound of splintering wood echoed across Willow Creek Estates as I hammered the final nail into what would become Karen Whitmore's worst nightmare. She stood on her pristine deck, clutching her morning latte like a weapon, her face twisted with the kind of rage that only comes from losing a war you started. What began as her petty crusade against my backyard chickens had just cost her the one thing she valued more than her HOA board position, her $1 million lake view 6 months earlier. I'd moved to this quiet lakeside community with nothing but my savings, my golden retriever Max, and dreams of the simple ranch life I'd always wanted. The house was perfect, a modest 2-story, with enough backyard space for the small chicken coop I'd been planning since my divorce. The realtor had assured me that keeping a few hens was perfectly legal under county zoning, and I'd even checked the HOA covenants twice. Chickens were allowed, as long as they were properly contained and didn't create a nuisance. My first week, I built a beautiful cedar co-op near the back fence, complete with a screened run and automatic waterers. I'd chosen 4 gentle buff Orpingtons, Henrietta, Beatrice, Clementine, and Dorothy. They were quiet, well-behaved ladies who provided fresh eggs and endless entertainment as they pecked around their enclosure each morning. That's when I met Karen. She appeared at my fence line on a Tuesday morning like a storm cloud in yoga pants. Karen Whitmore was everything you'd expect from an HOA board president, perfectly styled blonde hair that never moved in the wind, designer athleisure that cost more than my monthly mortgage, and the kind of smile that could curdle milk. "Oh, how quaint," she said, eyeing my chicken coop with the same expression most people reserve for roadkill. "I'm Karen Whitmore, HOA president. Welcome to the neighborhood." I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked over. "Nice to meet you, Karen. I'm David Chen. Just getting my girls settled in." "Girls?" Her penciled eyebrows shot up. "The chickens. They're very quiet, and I checked all the regulations before." "Yes, well," she cut me off with a wave of her manicured hand. "I'll need to review the installation myself. We have very strict standards about livestock." The way she said livestocks made it sound like I was running a cattle ranch instead of keeping 4 hens. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures from every angle, muttering notes to herself. Distance from property line, structure height, aesthetic impact. "Is there a problem?" I asked. Karen's smile could have frozen hell. "Oh no, no problem at all. I'm sure everything will be fine." But as she walked away, I caught her making a phone call. I couldn't hear the words, but her tone had shifted from fake sweet to businesslike. What I didn't know then was that she'd already started building a case against me before my chickens had even laid their first eggs. 2 weeks later, the first violation notice appeared in my mailbox like a coiled snake. NOT, ICEOF, COVENANTV, YOLATAON, it read in bold red letters. Property, 42 Lakewood Drive. Violation, unauthorized agricultural structure. Fine, $150. You have 10 days to remedy this violation, or additional penalties will apply. I read it 3 times before the words sank in. Agricultural structure? It was a chicken coop, no bigger than a garden shed. I'd followed every rule, every setback requirement, every guideline in the county code. That afternoon, I knocked on Karen's door. She answered, wearing a white tennis outfit that probably cost more than my car payment, a sweaty headband, suggesting she'd just returned from the country club. "David, what a surprise." Her voice dripped with false innocence. "Karen, I got this violation notice, but I think there's been a mistake. My chicken coop meets all the requirements." "Oh, that?" She waved dismissively. "The board reviewed your installation. We determined it violates Section 4.7 of the covenants regarding agricultural activities. But chickens are specifically allowed. I have the documentation right here I pulled out my folder of permits and regulations. Yes, chickens might be allowed by the county, she said, examining her perfectly manicured nails, but the HOA has additional restrictions. We have standards to maintain, property values to protect. What additional restrictions? I read every line of the covenants. Her smile turned predatory. Well, there's the aesthetic impact assessment, the noise ordinance considerations, the interpretation of what constitutes appropriate residential use. I felt my blood pressure rising. Interpretation? You can't just make up rules as you go along. I'm not making anything up, David. The board has full authority to interpret the covenants as we see fit. That's clearly stated in Article 12. She stepped closer, and I caught a whiff of her expensive perfume mixed with something that smelled like entitlement. The fact is, your chickens lower the tone of our community. This is Willow Creek Estates, not some rural farm. They're 4 quiet hens in a well-built co-op. They don't make noise. They don't smell. They don't bother anyone. They bother me, she said flatly. And several other residents have expressed concerns. Which residents? That's confidential board business. I stared at her for a long moment, watching that smug smile play across her lips. Fine. I'll see you at the next board meeting. You do that. She started to close the door, then paused. Oh, and David? The fine increases by $50 every week until you comply. As I walked back to my house, I noticed her watching me from her living room window, phone pressed to her ear. But what really caught my attention was the man with a clipboard standing in my backyard, measuring my chicken coop. The next board meeting was held in the community center, a sterile room that smelled like industrial carpet and broken dreams. I arrived 15 minutes early with a briefcase full of documentation, county permits, zoning laws, photographs of similar co-ops throughout the neighborhood, and a petition signed by 12 neighbors who supported my chickens. Karen sat at the head of a folding table like a queen holding court, flanked by 3 other board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. To her right sat Martha Hendricks, a sweet elderly woman who kept glancing at Karen nervously. On her left were Bob Mitchell, a retired accountant who seemed to be there under duress, and Sandra Torres, a newcomer who looked genuinely confused about why we were discussing poultry. Item 7, Karen announced in her most official voice. Ongoing covenant violation at 42 Lakewood Drive. I stood up. Before we begin, I'd like to present evidence that my chicken coop is completely legal and in compliance with all regulations. Mr. Chen, Karen interrupted, this isn't a trial. The board has already determined that your agricultural operation violates community standards. What specific standards? I opened my folder. Because I have documentation here showing that chickens are explicitly allowed under county zoning, and there's nothing in the HOA covenants that prohibits them. Martha Hendricks raised her hand tentatively. Actually, I remember when we reviewed those covenants 5 years ago, we specifically discussed chickens. Didn't we agree they were permitted as long as… Martha. Karen's voice could have cut steel. The board's current interpretation takes precedence. But we can't just change the rules whenever we feel like it, Bob Mitchell spoke up, looking uncomfortable. That's not how covenants work. Karen's jaw tightened. The covenants give the board broad authority to maintain community standards. Mr. Chen's chickens are clearly an agricultural use that's inappropriate for a residential community of our caliber. Our caliber? I couldn't keep the sarcasm out of my voice. Karen, half the houses in this neighborhood have vegetable gardens. Mrs. Peterson has beehives. The Johnsons have 3 goats. Those are different, she snapped. How are they different? They just are. Her face was starting to flush. The point is, your chicken coop is an eyesore that affects property values. For who? You can't even see it from the street, and the only house with a view of my backyard is yours." The silence that followed was deafening. Martha and Bob exchanged glances. Sandra looked like she was trying to solve a calculus problem in her head. "The decision stands," Karen said finally. "You have 1 week to remove the structure, or we'll be forced to take legal action." "Legal action?" I laughed. "For 4 chickens in a co-op that's perfectly legal?" "Mr. Chen," Karen's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, "you clearly don't understand how things work around here. This is a quality community with quality residents. We don't tolerate people who think the rules don't apply to them." I gathered my papers and stood up. "The rules do apply to me, Karen. All of them. Including the ones that say you can't arbitrarily fine people for legal activities just because you don't like them." As I walked toward the door, I heard her call out, "Mr. Chen, you have 7 days. After that, you'll be hearing from our attorney." I paused at the doorway and turned back. "Karen, can I ask you something?" "What?" "Why do you really care so much about 4 chickens?" For just a moment, her mask slipped. I saw something raw and ugly flash across her face. Not just annoyance, but genuine fury. "Because," she said slowly, "I worked very hard to make this neighborhood what it is. I won't have it ruined by someone who doesn't appreciate what we've built here." As I left the meeting, I could hear her voice through the door, sharp and angry as she spoke to the remaining board members. But it was Bob Mitchell's response that really caught my attention, "Karen. This is getting out of hand. You can't just—" The door slammed shut before I could hear the rest. But I had a feeling things were about to get much worse. 3 days later, I came home from work to find a code enforcement officer standing in my backyard with Karen, both of them examining my chicken coop like it was a nuclear reactor. "Excuse me," I called out as I walked through my back gate. "Can I help you?" The officer, a tired-looking man in his 50s named Pete Rodriguez, looked up from his clipboard. "Mr. Chen? I'm here about a complaint regarding unlicensed agricultural activity." I shot a look at Karen, who was standing there with her arms crossed and that infuriating smile. "What complaint?" "Someone reported that you're operating a commercial poultry facility without proper permits." "Commercial facility?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "It's 4 pet chickens." Pete walked over to the co-op, where Henrietta was pecking contentedly at some scattered corn. "How many birds do you have?" "4 hens." "No roosters." "Any sales of eggs or meat?" "I give eggs to neighbors sometimes, but I don't sell anything." Pete made some notes. "Well, the complaint mentioned dozens of birds, commercial-scale operations, noise complaints." He looked around at my modest setup and scratched his head. "This doesn't really match the report." Karen stepped forward. "Officer Rodriguez, perhaps you should check the health department regulations. And the zoning compliance. And the—" "Ma'am?" Pete held up a hand. "I know how to do my job." He turned back to me. "Mr. Chen, do you have documentation showing this is a legal residential use?" I pulled out the folder I'd started carrying everywhere. "County permits, zoning verification, health department approval for backyard poultry." Pete reviewed the documents, while Karen paced behind him like a caged tiger. After a few minutes, he handed them back. "Everything looks in order. The complaint appears to be exaggerated." "Exaggerated?" Karen's voice pitched higher. "Officer Rodriguez, surely there are other regulations that—" "Ma'am, with respect, this is a legal residential use. 4 chickens in a properly built co-op doesn't violate any county ordinances." Pete put his clipboard away. "Mr. Chen, you're all set. Nice-looking birds." After Pete left, Karen and I stood alone in my backyard. The afternoon sun was filtering through the oak trees, casting long shadows across the grass. My chickens were making their soft, contented sounds as they scratched around their run. "This isn't over," Karen said quietly. It should be. You just heard the county inspector. The county doesn't run this neighborhood. I do. She stepped closer, and I could see the fury blazing in her eyes. You have no idea who you're dealing with, David. No idea what I'm capable of. Karen, why are you doing this? Really, what is it about my chickens that bothers you so much? She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the chicken coop. Then she looked past it, toward the lake beyond my back fence. Her expression changed, not softer, but different, more calculated. You wouldn't understand, she said finally. You don't have anything worth protecting. As she walked away, I noticed her pause at the corner of my property, looking back at my coop and then toward her house. She pulled out her phone and took several photos, but not of the chickens. She was photographing the sight lines between her deck and the lake. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. Karen's obsession with my chickens seemed way out of proportion, even for someone who clearly had control issues. I stood on my back deck, looking toward the lake, trying to see what she saw. That's when it hit me. From Karen's house, my chicken coop was barely visible. But from her elevated deck, the one where she had her morning coffee every day, the one where she entertained guests, the one she'd probably spent a fortune building, you could see straight over my fence to the lake. Or you could until I'd built my coop. Suddenly, everything made sense. This wasn't about chickens, regulations, or property values. This was about Karen's view. My perfectly legal, properly built chicken coop sat right in the middle of her sight line to the lake. But if I was right, then what she'd said about this not being over took on a whole new meaning. She wasn't going to stop until she got her view back. The next morning, I woke up to find my chickens in distress. Henrietta was limping, Beatrice had lost several feathers, and there were scratch marks on the co-op that definitely weren't from chickens. Someone had been in my backyard during the night. I was examining the damage when I heard Karen's voice from the other side of the fence. Oh my goodness, what happened to your little birds? The false concern in her voice made my skin crawl. I walked to the fence line. Karen was standing in her garden, wearing pristine white gardening gloves that had clearly never touched actual dirt. Someone got into my yard last night and scared my chickens, I said, watching her face carefully. How terrible. You know, I was telling my husband just yesterday how dangerous it is to keep livestock so close to the wild areas. All sorts of predators around here. Raccoons, foxes, even coyotes. The damage wasn't from predators, Karen. Oh, how can you tell? Because predators don't use wire cutters. Her smile faltered for just a second. Wire cutters? How strange. Well, I hope your little birds will be okay. It would be such a shame if you had to get rid of them for safety reasons. That afternoon, I installed security cameras around my co-op. If Karen wanted to play dirty, I was going to be ready. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. I caught Karen watching me from her windows, and twice I saw her walking past my house slowly, like she was casing the place. The violation notices kept coming, each one more ridiculous than the last. Noise complaints for chickens that barely clucked. Health violations for a co-op I cleaned daily. Aesthetic violations for a structure that was better built than half the sheds in the neighborhood. Then came the lawyer's letter. Mr. Chen, it read, you are hereby notified that the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association intends to pursue legal action for continued covenant violations. You have 48 hours to remove the offending structure or face a lawsuit seeking injunctive relief and monetary damages up to $10,000. $10,000. For 4 chickens. I was sitting on my deck, staring at the letter, when my neighbor Jim Martinez walked over from next door. Heard you're having trouble with Queen Karen, he said, settling into one of my patio chairs. That's one way to put it. You know why she's really doing this, right? I looked up from the letter. The view? Jim nodded. Karen spent $60,000 building that deck specifically for the lake view. Had the architect designed it to perfectly frame the water? Then you put up your chicken coop right in her sightline. So this whole thing, the violations, the lawyer, the harassment, it's all because she can't see the lake? Welcome to Karen's world. She once sued the Hendersons for planting a tree that blocked 3 feet of her view. Took them to court and won. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. She won? HOA covenants have a view protection clause. It's buried in subsection 12.4. 7. Something about maintaining sightlines for community aesthetics. Karen wrote that clause herself when she became board president. I pulled out my copy of the covenants and found the section. There it was, in dense legal language. Any structure that materially impairs established view corridors could be considered a covenant violation. But my chicken coop isn't in any view corridor. It's on my property, behind my fence. Jim gave me a pitying look. David, Karen's been documenting her view for 3 years. She's got photos, measurements, property surveys. If she can prove your co-op blocks even part of her lake view, she'll win. That's insane. That's Karen. Jim stood up to leave, then paused. You know, though, there might be a way around this. How? Well, that view protection clause. It works both ways. If someone can prove their view has been established and is being protected by the HOA, then any structure that impairs it is a violation. He grinned. But what if someone else's view became more established? More documented? More protected? As Jim walked away, I stared at my chicken coop, then at Karen's deck, then at the lake beyond. An idea was forming, crazy, audacious, and probably impossible. But if Karen wanted to play hardball with property rights and view corridors, maybe it was time to show her what that game really looked like. But first, I needed to check something in the HOA records. And I had a feeling that what I found there would change everything. The next morning, I drove to the county records office with a specific mission. If Karen was going to use obscure covenant language against me, I needed to understand exactly what powers the HOA actually had and what they didn't. After 3 hours of digging through property deeds, covenant amendments, and board meeting minutes, I found what I was looking for. And it was better than I'd hoped. The view protection clause that Karen loved to cite? It had been added to the covenants in 2019 without proper homeowner approval. According to state law, any amendment affecting individual property rights required a 2/3 vote of all homeowners, not just the board. Karen had simply inserted the clause during a routine update and never put it to a proper vote. But there was something even better buried in the original 1,987 covenants, something Karen had apparently overlooked when she was rewriting rules to suit herself. Section 3.2. 4 of the original covenants stated that any homeowner could construct reasonable agricultural structures on their property as long as they were properly maintained and aesthetically appropriate. There was even a grandfather clause protecting any agricultural use that predated new restrictions. Karen's view protection amendment wasn't just invalid, it directly contradicted the original covenants. Armed with this information, I made a few phone calls and discovered something interesting. 3 other homeowners in the neighborhood had received violation notices for various view impairment issues. The Patels had been fined for their pergola. The Smiths were fighting a violation for their kids' treehouse. Even elderly Mrs. Henderson had been cited for her rose arbor. Karen had been systematically using her fake amendment to bully neighbors into modifying their property to preserve her views. That evening, I called an emergency meeting. By 7 p.m., my living room was packed with neighbors, not just the ones who'd been harassed by Karen, but several others who were tired of her authoritarian approach to HOA management. Martha Hendricks was there, looking nervous but determined. Bob Mitchell brought copies of board meeting minutes, going back 5 years. Even Sandra Torres showed up, finally understanding what she'd gotten herself into by joining the board. "Here's what I found," I said, spreading the documents across my coffee table. Karen's View Protection Clause was never legally adopted. Every fine she's issued based on that clause is invalid. But she said the board had authority. Martha began. "The board has authority to interpret existing covenants, not to create new ones without homeowner approval." I showed them the state statute. Any amendment affecting individual property rights requires a 2/3 vote of all homeowners. Bob Mitchell was studying the original covenants. "This agricultural provision. It's pretty clear. Reasonable agricultural structures are specifically allowed. So all those violation notices," Sandra looked sick, "are bogus," I finished. But here's where it gets interesting. If Karen wants to claim her view is protected, I can claim the same protection for my agricultural use. And according to the original covenants, agricultural use takes precedence over aesthetic considerations. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. "So what are you proposing, David?" I looked around the room at my neighbors, good people who'd been bullied and intimidated by Karen's power trip for too long. "I'm proposing we expand my agricultural operation." The next morning, I was in my backyard before dawn, implementing phase 1 of what I'd started calling Project Cluck You, Karen. I'd spent the night researching the maximum number of chickens allowed under county zoning, 25, and the specific language about reasonable agricultural structures. By 8 a.m., when Karen typically took her coffee onto her deck, I was assembling a second chicken coop. This one was positioned strategically, not just blocking her direct view of the lake, but creating a backdrop that would make her morning coffee ritual decidedly less scenic. Karen appeared on schedule, coffee cup in hand, wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than my monthly utilities. She took one look at the construction scene in my backyard and nearly dropped her mug. "DAVID!" she shrieked across the fence. "WHATAREYUDOING?" I looked up from the instruction manual for the deluxe chicken coop kit I'd ordered overnight. "Morning, Karen. Just expanding my agricultural operation. Completely legal under the original 1987 covenants. You can't just build another co-op. That's explicitly protected under Section 3.2. 4. I held up a copy of the original covenants. The part about reasonable agricultural structures being allowed as long as they're properly maintained? Karen's face went through several interesting color changes. "The board will never allow this." "Actually," came Martha's voice from behind her, "the board already voted." Karen spun around to see Martha Hendricks standing at the fence line, looking more confident than I'd ever seen her. "What vote?" "There was no vote. Emergency board meeting last night," Bob Mitchell said, joining Martha. "We reviewed the documentation David provided about the Invalid View Protection Amendment. Sandra Torres appeared at my back gate. We also voted to reverse all violation notices issued under that amendment." Karen looked like she was about to have an aneurysm. "You can't have a board meeting without me." "I'm the president." "Actually," Martha said, consulting a piece of paper, according to the bylaws, any 3 board members can call an emergency meeting if there's evidence of improper governance. "We voted you out as president, effective immediately." "You? What?" Karen's voice came out as a strangled whisper. "We also voted Bob in as the new president," Sandra added. "His first official act was to approve David's agricultural expansion." I couldn't have scripted Karen's expression better if I'd tried. She stood there in her expensive robe, clutching her designer coffee cup, staring at the 3 board members who had just stripped away everything she'd spent years building. This is illegal," I'll sue. I'll have all of you thrown off the board. Karen, Bob said patiently, you're welcome to try. But you might want to check with your lawyer first. The one who's been sending those violation letters? I called him this morning. Apparently, he was never told about the questionable legal basis for those fines. He's not very happy about that. Karen's phone rang. She answered it without thinking, probably expecting support from somewhere in her network of enablers. Hello? Her face went white. What do you mean you're withdrawing representation? But we have a contract. Her voice trailed off as she listened. Ethical concerns? What ethical concerns? She hung up and stood there for a moment, staring at her phone like it had bitten her. Karen, I called out, as a gesture of goodwill, I'd like to offer you a compromise. She looked up, and for a moment I saw something almost hopeful in her eyes. I'm planning to add a really nice chicken run along the back fence, you know, where your view of the lake used to be. But I could be persuaded to build it a little lower, maybe plant some screening shrubs, if you'd like to formally apologize to all the neighbors you've harassed over the years. The hope died instantly. I will never apologize to you or anyone else in this neighborhood. That's fine, I said, returning to my Coop assembly. I respect your choice. I also respect my right to keep chickens. All 25 of them. 25? Oh, did I not mention? I'm getting 21 more hens next week. Rhode Island Reds, Australorps, Sussex. Really beautiful birds. They'll need a much bigger run, of course. Probably extending the full length of the back fence. Karen made a sound like a deflating balloon. The good news is, I continued, you'll have a great view of my agricultural operation. Very pastoral. Very rural. As I worked on the new co-op throughout the morning, I could hear Karen on her deck, making increasingly frantic phone calls. First to lawyers who wouldn't take her case. Then to city officials who confirmed that my chickens were completely legal. Finally, to what sounded like family members who were not particularly sympathetic to her plight. By noon, she was standing at my fence again, but her demeanor had changed completely. Gone was the entitled HOA queen. In her place was someone who looked genuinely desperate. David, she said quietly, can we talk? I set down my hammer. Sure, Karen. What's on your mind? I might have been a little hasty about the chickens. A little hasty? She winced. Okay, a lot hasty. Look, maybe we can work something out. Some kind of compromise. I studied her face. The fight had gone out of her completely. What kind of compromise? What if I helped you build a really nice chicken setup? Something that worked for both of us? Both of us. Well, you get to keep your chickens, and maybe I get to keep a little bit of my view? I pretended to consider this. That's an interesting idea, Karen. But I'm curious what made you change your mind? She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ground. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and tired. My husband left this morning. I'm sorry to hear that, he said. He said he was embarrassed by how I'd been acting. Said he couldn't live with someone who spent all her time trying to control other people. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. He was right. I've been a terrible neighbor. A terrible person. I felt a pang of something that might have been sympathy. Karen, I know I can't undo what I've done. But maybe I could try to be better? I looked at her standing there. No makeup, no perfect outfit, no commanding presence. Just a lonely, scared woman who'd lost her way in the pursuit of control. Karen, if you're serious about being a better neighbor, then yes, I think we can work something out. Really? Really. But it starts with apologizing to everyone you've hurt. Not because I'm making you, but because it's the right thing to do. She nodded slowly. I can do that. 6 months later, I was sitting on my back deck, watching my chickens, all 8 of them, not 25, pecking around their beautifully landscaped run. Karen had been true to her word. She'd apologized to every neighbor she'd wronged, resigned from the HOA board entirely, and even helped me design a chicken area that was both functional and aesthetically pleasing. The new setup was actually an improvement over my original plan. The co-op was larger and more attractive. The run had natural screening that provided privacy for both my birds and Karen's view, and the whole thing had become a conversation piece that neighbors actually admired. Karen herself had changed too. She still lived next door, but the imperious HOA queen was gone, replaced by someone who actually seemed interested in being part of the community instead of ruling it. She'd started volunteering at the animal shelter and had even asked me for advice on starting her own small garden. The irony wasn't lost on me that my chickens, the source of all the drama, had ended up being the catalyst that brought our neighborhood closer together. As I sat there, enjoying the peaceful evening, I heard my back gate open. Karen appeared carrying a basket of vegetables from her new garden. "Peace offering," she said with a genuine smile, the first real smile I'd ever seen from her. "Thought you might like some fresh tomatoes for dinner." "Thanks, Karen. How's the garden coming along?" "Well, I'm learning that you can't control plants any more than you can control people." She laughed, and it was a different sound than the sharp, brittle laugh I remembered. Turns out gardening requires patience, compromise, and accepting that sometimes things don't go according to your plan. "Funny how that works." She nodded toward my chickens. "You know, I actually enjoy watching them in the mornings now. They're quite relaxing. Much more relaxing than HOA drama." Karen laughed again. "You know what's strange? I can still see the lake just fine from my deck. I don't know why I thought your chicken coop was blocking so much of the view." I could have told her the truth, that the view had never been blocked, that her obsession with control had made her see problems that didn't exist. But sometimes the best victory is the one where everyone gets to save face. Sometimes our perspective changes when we stop looking for problems and start looking for solutions. "Wise words from a chicken farmer," Karen said with a grin. As she walked back to her house, I reflected on the whole ridiculous situation. Karen had tried to fine me for my ranch chickens, thinking she could bully me into submission. Instead, she'd lost her position, her marriage, and nearly her sanity all over 4 birds who just wanted to peck around in the sunshine. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. Sometimes it's giving your enemy the chance to become your friend. But if they're not interested in friendship, well, 25 chickens can make for a very effective property line.